Ahoy and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and this week I'm excited to be joined by a friend of a very good friend, Jay Vette, whose name I have now figured out how to say. I will one day actually know how to say a guest name before I get on the show. But what's up, Jay?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Good. We were just talking about how we both just got off work, so we needed I didn't want to hit record right away because I think we both need just a minute to
I
breathe.
actually had to switch laptops in order to do this. So
Oh yeah.
I had to close one and open another. So
It's so I have a work laptop. I think a lot of people do. I just think it's so weird how many devices I end up owning because I have my work laptop, I have my gaming PC, and I have the machine that I'm on right now where I'm recording. Where it's like, why do I have so many fucking computers? This is ridiculous. Nobody needs this many machines.
I try to keep my number of electronic devices that I own to a minimum. I have my work laptop, which I don't really see myself as owning because it's company property.
That's fair.
And then I have the laptop that I'm doing this interview on, my personal laptop,
Mhm.
which, pretty much everyone's got a laptop at this point. I have my iPhone. And as for personal electronic devices, that's about it. I don't have an iPad. I don't have an Apple Watch. I don't have any of that stuff.
I
Friends
have a
do.
I have a Fitbit, but I don't have one of the super smart Fitbits. I have the one that just tells me my steps, my heart rate, and when I sleep. And I'm kind of okay with that because that's specifically what I got it to track. It's like, yeah,
Right.
I want to track fitness and stuff. But anyway, outside of fitness, obviously we are here to talk about Titanic. Speaking of my Fitbit, it just went the hell off. But what is your Titanic story, Jay? Because I don't know your story at all.
So, okay. So I first saw the film, from what I can remember, I was about 7 years old. So this was 1998.
I think
And
that
my
we're a
parents,
similar age because I was born
yeah,
in 89.
yeah, I was born in 91. So
Mm-hmm.
I was 7 years old in 1998. So this was after it was in theaters.
Right.
And my parents were watching it on TV. Some TV channel was showing it, and I happened to come downstairs and see some of it. And so, ever since I was really young, I had been interested in mechanical things,
Hmm.
mainly cars. I was really into cars. Specifically, at this time of my life, I was really into Edwardian era cars for whatever reason. Everybody else was into Corvettes and Ferraris and everything, but I was
Yeah.
into Edwardian cars.
They do
And
have a very, very distinct look. I mean, and I'm not
they
saying
do.
that to sound like the world's most obvious statement, but it's not something we don't make cars like that today.
Well,
That's
I
an
mean, we
antiquated shape.
can't we can't make cars like that today because of
It,
safety regulations and everything.
yes.
But yeah, so I was really into cars that looked like from the early 1900s.
Hmm.
And so I happened to see, probably shouldn't really have seen the scene in the movie where they're in the car. And I
The
was mostly
famous
like,
car scene.
I wasn't really paying attention to what they were doing in the car. I was mostly like, whoa, that's a really cool car. That's super awesome. Because that's where my mind was at the time. I was 7. I didn't know what they were doing, and I
Oh,
couldn't care less. So I was
I
like,
still don't know
wow,
what they're doing.
yeah, you do. But we know what they were doing. But I was
Right.
mostly like, wow, that's a really cool car. And then I think probably came into the movie shortly before that scene happened. So that's about what, halfway through ish? Because it's right before the ship hits the
Yeah, it's
iceberg.
right before, right at that halfway point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I came in the movie about halfway through.
Hmm.
So the car scene happens, and I stay there and I watch the rest, the sinking and all of that. And I was just kind of fascinated by
Hmm.
what I now know is the special effects and everything in that scene in the sinking scenes in the movie.
Right.
So then it astounded me and everything. And so I was like, well, what is this? And my parents were like, oh, this was a ship called the Titanic. It sank almost 100 years ago, so on and so forth. And I was kind of hooked on it, I guess. And so I wanted to know more about it. And my parents they bought me a whole bunch of books about it. I even still have a couple, I guess, kids books about the
Oh.
Titanic there. I have probably the best one I got was they bought me one called 882 and a half amazing answers to your questions about the Titanic or something. And it's
Mm-hmm.
literally just a book of facts about the ship. And
I know
it's
this one.
called, you know, the book.
I do. I don't own it,
Okay.
but I am familiar with the book.
Then yeah, so you're familiar with it.
Mhm.
So I have that book and I had other, like books about like the children on the Titanic and like
Mhm.
one about like there was one about like a teddy bear or something.
I have a vague idea of what you're talking about, but again, that was not one that I read, so I don't know what it's
Right.
called, but I know what you're talking
Yeah, I
about.
forget. It was called like some teddy bear named the Titanic Bear, something like that. Anyway,
Yes.
I had a whole bunch of books about it. I drew a whole bunch of pictures of the Titanic at the time. I got really good at it.
Nice.
My profession is I'm a graphic designer, so I've
Oh,
actually
how
been
cool.
doing art stuff for a very long time. And so I would draw a ton of pictures of the Titanic and I would go like I went to a couple exhibits and stuff in my younger days and stuff.
Mhm.
And so super into it and when I was a kid. And I mean, I still am. And of course, the way that I approach my fascination with it has changed over the years.
Sure.
Like I said, when I first saw the movie, I was mainly just interested in the whole mechanical aspect, and also just kind of interested in how the ship went down, like the pure mechanics of, oh, it hit the iceberg and that popped the rivets in the hull and it took this long to sink, and the
Hmm.
reason it broke apart was because of the stresses and all of that stuff, and like, oh,
Yeah,
the
as you were
engines are
saying,
big,
the
what
literal
do they do?
mechanics.
Yes, just like the mechanics. And so that was what I was interested in initially, was just the pure like facts about it and the mechanic. I wasn't really at that time, I didn't really have like an emotional connection to, like, the actual loss of life in the disaster, you
Sure.
know. And that was obviously very much informed by the Cameron film,
Yeah.
and how, because that was like how I viewed it, was through the lens of the Cameron film.
Hmm.
And so then the older I got, like, I guess the next, I guess you could say, phase in my interest, and this is kind of specific to the movie, was actually more about like the characterizations of, well, the characters in the film. And so I guess when I was like, a preteen and teenager, I kind of reevaluated the film and like, this is kind of like the special effects are still amazing and everything, and the story was
Hmm.
good. But I was like, man, this love story is kind of dumb. Because I was like, come on, who falls in love that fast? You're like, you're on the ship for 4 days. What are
Hmm.
you doing? This is stupid. Like, this is completely unrealistic. This would never happen. But then as I got older, my perception of that changed again.
Hmm.
Because then I was like, well, Rose is caught in a situation she doesn't want to be in. She's in an abusive relationship with Cal
Hmm.
and her mother, who only wants her to marry Cal so they can keep the family fortune and their good name in good standing
All their
and
fancy
everything.
stuff.
And she just feels completely trapped. And I mean, of course, she says so in the movie, like
Hmm.
several times, about how trapped she feels. And so I was like, well, in that situation, I can kind of understand how she just desperately wants to escape from this life that has been planned out for her. And so when she finds a guy who's actually willing to consider what she wants out of life and even asks her questions she never even thought about, like, what do you actually want to do? It's not this plan. I can understand why she would fall for him. Also, she's like 17.
Hmm.
Teenagers, they do that sort of thing. They fall quickly, especially for someone who actually shows a modicum of real interest in them that isn't just, I want to marry you because you're hot. So
Right.
like,
I've
yeah.
now, as I'm older, heard one Not one too many. I was going to say one too many. That's not what I meant. But I've heard a lot more stories of people who, went on vacation or like went on a cruise when they were younger, like not even necessarily 16, but, anywhere between that like 15 to 19 range. And you're having a good time somewhere, you're away from everyone. And, I think the example that I come up with in fiction is Grease, where Sandy and Danny at the very beginning, it's like they're on vacation, they're in this completely different place and he can be himself, and it's this cute, really intense little romance that happens just away from your normal world, and that hit really intensely. And then, like you said, there's the additional thing in this movie of no one's ever really just been nice to Rose because she was a human being,
Right.
and that's a really, really big deal if you've been sort of othered your whole life and no one's ever looked at you besides what you are. If someone finally gives consideration to who you are.
Exactly. Like Jack, treated her as her own person with her own opinions and desires. And he kind of like, he's very much a symbolic figure who kind
Yes.
of represents the freedoms that she can't have, essentially, in her current life, being stifled by her parents and her fiance and everything. So, I mean, I think you talked about this in probably one of your previous episodes about how Jack is very much a manic pixie dream boy type character. And I 100% agree. He very much is. In fact, you always hear about like the manic pixie dream girl trope. And I'm like,
Yep.
are there any examples of like a male version of that? And Jack Dawson is absolutely that. He's totally that.
I have to give credit to the Midnight Boys, who also discussed that in depth, and it's not totally like an original thought of mine, but it is. I could talk a little bit more about that. So
Yeah.
I'm not like a film student or anything. I know that there are people who have genuinely studied film, but
Mhm.
as I talked about like a second ago, I was born in 1989. So when in the 2000s is kind of when I was quote unquote coming into my own. I was becoming not an adult, but becoming a person with opinions, beginning to notice the world and trying to figure out like, who am I and where do I fit in? And that era of film, the movies that were popular around then were this very specific genre of rom-com where, yep, you're nodding because I think you know exactly where I'm going with this. It's
Yes,
all
I know
those
where you're going.
it's all those, the guy kind of negs on the girl, is kind of an asshole to her the whole time, and then she goes through a makeover to change herself because she's the problem. And happily ever after. And that teaches you two things as a woman or a person who's assigned female at birth. I'm going to expand that. For people who are born AFAB, it's like it teaches you two things. Number one, you are always the problem. It is always going to be on you to fix whatever is wrong. Because I'm thinking specifically of like again going back to Greece, like Danny is rude to her the
Danny
whole
is a
movie.
complete fucking dick.
Yeah, he's
And
such a dick.
Sandy should have dropped his ass, honestly. I don't know
100%.
why she decided to change her. Like, God, Grease is another one of those movies. I watched it when I was younger. I was
Right.
like, oh, the music's cool. That the car they build in Grease, like, that's a super cool
That's
car. I love that
fun.
race. And then I watch it now and I'm like, she is being gaslit the entire time.
Yeah, and
And this is awful. And she should drop him and he sucks.
yeah, and then in the aughts there was 10 Things I Hate About You. She's all that. She's the man. It was full of these movies of which the moral ended up being you are the problem. You have to change. And that's also combined with the reality TV culture that promoted the concept of heroin thin and heroin chic. It was like, you have to be thin,
Yeah.
you have to be
Kate
this.
Moss.
Yes, you are the problem, you're the issue. If he doesn't like you, if he is mean to you, that's on you to change it. You need to fix it because you're the problem. And then they
Exactly.
made the movie Titanic, where that character was relegated to the villain role. He wasn't the love interest. That was Cal. The love
Mm-hmm.
interest was, quote unquote, a character. Guys would be like, oh, he's so weak. He's so whipped or whatever. It's like, that's actually untrue. That's actually an extremely healthy version of masculinity because he actually cares about his partner.
Yeah, and you would think that a lot of guys would say that about his character, but from
Hmm.
the reactions I've gotten from other men I know in my life who have watched the movie is they actually like Jack as a character
Hmm.
because he represents that kind of like swashbuckling Errol Flynn type, like free-spirited adventurer, you know?
Yes.
And so any claims of him being a beta male or whatever the hell the terminology is now are like
Ugh.
kind of they don't see that in him because he's this other ideal of masculinity where he is unencumbered by the shackles of life or whatever. Even though he's, dirt poor, as he explains during that dinner scene, that affords him a ton of freedom that the rich people don't have.
Hmm.
And I
And he,
mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, the rich people, of course, have freedom in terms of their money,
sure.
but especially back in that time period, it was a very regulated society. And so, even though poor people were, of course, extremely disadvantaged during the Gilded Era, I guess the one thing they did have was relative freedom compared to the upper class.
This is going to sound like it's unrelated, but did you see the podcast? Did you see the documentary series on Netflix, Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey?
Yes.
It's tremendous. If anyone's wondering, please make sure that you are in a spot in the kind of space where you can watch it. It's very tough, but it's very
Yeah.
good. But
That's the one about the no, it's not the one about the Duggars. That's a different one.
no, this is the oh
That's the one
geez.
about the FLDS.
Yep, there we go.
Yes.
Yes. So
Hmm.
there's one section, I think even in the beginning, where they're kind of doing that quick thing in the beginning where they show you a bunch of the clips for what's to come. And they show a woman, and I can't remember her name, but where she basically says something along the lines of, I would rather have died than said no. That's how much control they had. And I know that sounds like they're unrelated, but you think about some people think that Rose's reaction is extreme. Like, why wouldn't you just say no? Why would you just get out? When you're so entrenched in an abusive relationship or so entrenched in a very carefully orchestrated society like the FLDS, there isn't a just get out. In 1912, for a woman, even a rich woman, if she were to walk away from her home, she doesn't walk away with a bag of jewels. She walks away with nothing.
Right. She has absolutely everything to lose in
Yes.
society. I know what you mean. This is also going off on the FLDS tangent. I actually read a book written by a woman who escaped that whole cult society thing.
Oof.
Like it was called Escape and it detailed like what happened to her as a member of the FLDS and what her husband would do to her
Mm.
and the absolute brainwashing they would go through to make it seem like it was all okay and part of God's plan and this and everything, and how she saw that once it started happening to the other women around her and her own children, she
Mm.
was like, I can't stay here. I have to leave.
Hmm.
And she did lose like almost apart from her children, and even not all of her children even came with her. Some of them stayed behind because they were just conditioned to accept that the outside world was awful and
Yeah.
they have to stay. And so she left with like her younger children, and she had nothing. She had absolutely nothing except for like one person on the outside who agreed to house her and her kids. Like that was all she had. She had the clothes on her back and her kids. That is it. So yeah, no, I agree. Like, especially for a woman back in that time, even if you were rich, you had no freedoms. You had nowhere you could go. You had no one you could turn to unless there was like an organization or someone who took pity on you. So yeah, that's why Rose at one point in the movie she decides she's going to jump off the back of the ship because she'd rather be dead than confined to the life that her mother and Cal have made for her.
I think that we've gotten better as a society about mental health between now and then. We obviously have a long way to go.
Mhm.
to where, people might look at the decision and think, well, why would you jump to such extreme like that's such a big step to take. And like we were discussing here, it's simply because you didn't have another option. You would, even now, for many people, there's a reason that there's a statistic that's like it takes people often up to, gosh, 7 times to leave an abusive relationship.
Mhm.
People don't go back to abusive relationships because they're like, I'm bored. I'd like to get beat up again. That's not what happens. It's, I'm on the streets now with or without a child. I have no food. I have no job because, these people get very isolated. I have no clothes. I have nowhere to go, nothing to turn to except this man.
Right. And he provides
Yeah, he
like
might,
a
be.
modicum of security and food. He might be absolutely awful, but he is your meal ticket. He is
Right.
your housing ticket. You have
Yeah.
nowhere else to go. I personally know a few women who have escaped abusive relationships, and yeah, it took them years
Mhm.
to even muster up the courage to be able to do it because they had nowhere else to go. And so it's either, I live out on the streets with absolutely nothing to my name, or I get abused here, but at least I have a home and food and electricity and running water and all of that. And so yeah, it's an impossible decision to make.
And then you add in something like Rose's dynamic, where not only do you have nothing outside of you, but in this situation, you also have everyone around you telling you, basically, aren't you so lucky? It's a fine match with Hockley. He's rich, he can provide, and to everyone else, he's very charming. So
Oh, of
the outside
course, they
world,
always are. They're always so
exactly,
charming to everyone else.
precisely. So the outside world just sees, what are you so bitter about? Why are you just being so rude? Why are you so mean at dinner? What is your problem? They don't see everything else.
Right. And so like Jack represents the complete opposite of all of that.
Mhm.
And so of course she latches on to him because he is kind and gentle to her, and he asks her about her life and her fears and her desires, and he doesn't really expect anything of her like everyone else does.
Right.
And of course that is why she's attracted to him. I mean, I'm sure he probably, may have wanted to get laid or something, but
I'm
like he
sure,
doesn't
but
really expect that it will happen. And it's notable during that car scene, of course, now that I've watched it a million times, that Rose is the initiator
mm-hmm.
in their one, intimate moment that they had. She was the one who took it there, and he was kind of passive in that role, which you don't see a lot in film.
No, and I also think that that's important to acknowledge because I'm going to bring up the Barbie movie again, but
Also, a good movie.
sorry, not sorry, everyone, but part of America Ferrera's monologue
Mm-hmm.
is basically the dichotomy of how you have to be this, but not to that. And one of the things that's very interesting, about, again, being AFAB is that sort of Madonna horror complex where
Mm-hmm.
it's kind
Definitely.
of, yeah, and it's very interesting that in this particular case that they chose to let this female character show sexual agency, because normally especially of that time period, a character doing that is like, she's a slut, lock her up, put her in the stocks, she's a whore. There's all that energy to it, and it's just like, she just wants to fuck, man. I mean, like, it's
Right.
not
I
it's
mean,
not that complicated.
she's 17,
Yes.
hormones are raging high. She's found this cute guy who doesn't treat her like shit.
Yep.
Of course she does. Come on.
I mean,
And so
and that's normal.
as soon as she can get away from her mother and Cal, and she's like, all right, let's go.
Mhm. And
I'm down for
also,
this.
as we keep finding out throughout history, like the Victorians and people from those time periods were fucking filthy. People in history are just almost just gross when you think about it. So I was like, dude, you think you're kinky now? There's no way that modern society has out kinked the kinkers of the past. I can't prove it. I just don't think it's true.
I mean, listen to like, hear about like Caligula and everybody. So no,
Well,
you're right. We can't out kink them. Like, man, that dude. I mean, who knows if those stories are true, but like if they are,
sure.
damn.
Right, but I mean, even though society as a whole was more outwardly prudish,
Yes.
it didn't mean that people, weren't into it. And again, she was, as we're discussing, she's finally realizing, and I think more important than just like the concept of sex and romance, she's realizing that there is a whole category of human beings out there who will look at her as more than just something they can benefit from. Like when she gets introduced to Fabrizio and Tommy, and they say, they're all hanging out at the party later on. No one's looking at her like, "Hey Rose, next round's on you, eh?" They're just kind of like, "Look, she's dancing. What a
Yeah.
fun time."
Yeah. I mean, they pretty much. I mean, she has very limited interaction with Fabrizio and Tommy, but I mean, the few interactions she does have, they're not like staring at her like she's an alien or anything. They're just like, okay, yeah, she's rich, but like,
Mhm.
hey, she can party with the best of us.
And for her, that to me, that seems really important, because I feel as though one of the, again, this is going to sound like, wow, what a profoundly obvious statement. But one of the best ways to sort of break down barriers is to have innocuous interactions.
Hmm.
And it's that sort of thing where it's like, she didn't need to have some crazy thing where like, and this is my friend, don't worry, they're not going to stare. It's just like, this is my friend Tommy, this is Fabry, this is Rose,
Well, I
a
mean,
beer.
Jack and the way the third class passengers as a whole are portrayed is
Mm-hmm.
pretty lax and easygoing. I mean, they're the ones having that super awesome Celtic music party downstairs, drinking beer, doing arm wrestling and just dancing around. Whereas, contrasted with what the men in the smoking room are doing upstairs, where it seems so stuffy. They're up there smoking cigars, having brandy, talking about, I don't know, stocks or whatever the hell it is rich people talk about.
Part
It's
of that,
not fun.
no, it's not. And part of that too is also that ocean liner travel was changing.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, I've talked about it briefly on the show, but up until this time, steerage literally meant steerage. If, third class, you brought your own food, you brought your own bedding. It kind of sucked.
Yes.
People
I
got
do
sick.
remember reading that the Titanic was one of the first ships where the
Mm-hmm.
steerage passengers, I mean,
Yes.
yeah, they were still in the bowels of the ship where it was
Mm-hmm.
probably the most uncomfortable because of the vibration from the engines and everything.
Sure.
But like they had electricity and running water. They
Mm-hmm.
had like flushing toilets,
Well,
which is
more,
something ships did not have up until a couple years beforehand.
but I think almost more interestingly to me is that so nowadays it's really easy for you and me to just go to Applebee's, where someone will
Right.
take our order and bring us our food for us and take our dishes away.
Yes, and they didn't have to bring their own food. It was
No,
served
they
to
had
them.
it. They not only didn't have to bring their own food, but as you just said, most importantly, it was served to them. For many of these people, they had spent their entire lives being the servants. They
Yeah.
had never in their lives had someone bring them a hot meal for them to eat at their leisure. They didn't have to rush. This wasn't a mess hall. They could just eat their food. And this was the first time many of them had their own beds. For many of them, they lived in communal housing or row housing or many, children to a bed.
Right.
It was an experience that they never had. So I know that there's a lot of like, oh my gosh, it's third class, we're all like giggly and what have you. It's like they weren't giggly just because poor people don't have any sense. That wasn't what
No,
it
they were
was.
giggly because they were introduced to facilities that they had never seen.
Yes. And
Like they had their own bed. I mean, yeah, it was like four guys to a room that maybe
right,
you didn't know, but you were at least each in your own beds.
your own
You
bed.
had electric lights, you had running water, you had food, like you said, that was served to you. And it was food that, like, I mean, I've read like the historical menus and stuff.
Yeah,
Even for third class, it was pretty damn good food.
I would
Like
eat
it
it.
wasn't just gruel and slop. It was
No, it was
freshly
food.
baked bread. It was meat. It was fresh fruits and vegetables, even, which required refrigeration technology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I am sure that, the third class passengers had barely ever experienced anything like that before.
No, and for many of them, when you see a lot of the surviving letters, there's, a lot of the descriptions are like, oh, and the food. And it sounds like people are being a little like Disney princessy about it. And it's like, oh, and they could have spoken about the food for ages. But for
Yeah,
many people, it's like they could have spoken about the food for ages. They'd never had some of these dishes before. That's important to understand. Now you go on a Carnival cruise. Oh my God. My boyfriend and I went on a cruise earlier this year, and it absolutely just blew me away. Because first of all, you got a lot of food. There's so much food, and it's all pretty good. But there were some people that would order like two for themselves, by the way, two appetizers, two entrees, and two desserts. It's just sort of like, whoa, I don't know where you're putting all that. And that's kind of normal now. But then, you think all the way back to these 1912 folks in the Titanic who are like, somebody just brought me bread on a plate.
right.
Thank me.
I've never personally been on a cruise. I've heard varying things about cruises are, so I'm not sure I'm entirely excited about the idea. I've heard they're crowded and regimented and disease harbingers. Yeah.
I I enjoyed my time. I will also say like a cruise is what you make out of it. Like I like to go on a cruise to decompress. So I actually spend a lot of time like just hanging out. Like I'll hang out in the adult only lounge, just chilling. Like I'm not constantly running from activity to activity.
Hmm.
I'm more like the number one activity on the Titanic was promenading, just wandering around up and
Right.
down and hanging out on the deck. That's me. I'm like, I just want to hang out on the deck, watch the world, sun, have a little drink,
That's
chill.
also probably something the steerage passengers weren't used to. They had the poop deck as like their
Hmm.
entire promenade space. They
Hmm.
actually had a promenade space,
Yeah.
which would have probably blown some of their minds just to be able to just have an area like outside where they could just hang out.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that there weren't issues. There were a lot of, we talk
Right.
about the gates that were the strongest in the Titanic were not actually made out of iron. They were made out of societal expectations. Uh
Yes.
and it's true. Like I think it was less that they actually locked people up and more the sort of knowledge that it was an unspoken caste society at the time. Not quite as intense as, say, India, but
I mean, they literally broke people up into classes. There was the
mhm,
first class for all the rich folks, and the second class for the middle class folks, and then third class or steerage for the poor folks. And that's it. And they were not allowed to intermingle.
nope.
And so, even though, yes, they had all this great food and the facilities they'd never seen before and all of that, they were kept strictly separate. And yeah, it wasn't really like the reason most of the third class passengers didn't survive the sinking wasn't because they were physically locked from accessing the lifeboats like the movie would have you believe. Actually, it was more that like they were down in the bowels of the ship. It was a maze to get up to the boat deck in order to access the lifeboats, and a lot of these people were immigrants who didn't speak English,
Mhm.
and all the signs were in English because that's how it was back then. It was a British ship. All the officers and the stewards, they all spoke English. So if you didn't speak English, you were kind of shit out of luck.
There were a lot of things, unfortunately, that would work against you. It's looking at the negative sides of why everyone likes the story so much. And the negative sides are that, it was still very much like a class-based society. There was still a lot of racism. There was a lot of misogyny happening. There was a lot of very outrightly negative things.
Yes, and that kind of brings me to another phase, I guess you would say, in my interest of the Titanic is learning about some of the people on the ship who didn't really get their stories told. For example, the Chinese passengers
Hmm.
who, I mean, there's that documentary out there, The Six, about the Chinese
Hmm.
passengers
Have you
that
seen it?
no, I haven't seen it because it's
It's
not,
really good.
technically available in the US.
Yeah, I know.
But
It's
I
it's
know that
it's very frustrating.
you had the director or the writer or of that documentary on your show a few episodes back.
Yeah, I had Steven on. He
Yeah.
is like the editor, writer, producer. kind of involved
Right.
person with the six. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so when I heard about that, my first reaction was, there were Chinese people on the Titanic?
I
Like,
know,
I didn't
right?
even know. I had no
No.
clue. And so then I was like, this is actually fascinating because I pretty much thought it was all white people the entire time. Like, even the movie would mostly have you believe that the immigrants were like Irish and Italian and like Swedish and all of that. But
Yeah.
although there are, now that I've watched the movie a few times since, there are a couple instances like there's a one scene where a Jack and Rose are, going through the corridors trying to escape, and there is this couple speaking Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, wait, I don't think I really paid attention to that before. And so I have then learned that there were quite a few third class passengers from the former Ottoman Empire, like
Mm-hmm.
Syrians and Armenians, Palestinians, and they were there, and there was a good number of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the Chinese passengers, of whom only two died, six actually managed to survive. And of course, when they got to the U.S., they weren't allowed in because of the anti-Chinese immigration laws.
Yep.
Which, it's like, oh, I knew about that, so I was like, I didn't even know there were Chinese passengers on the Titanic, but of course that is how they were treated, even though they survived. And all the
Right.
newspaper reports portrayed them as cowardly and all of that because that's just what they did back then.
Yep. It was just easier to do things like that.
And then I even learned about like Joseph LaRoche, who
Mm-hmm.
was, as far as we know, the only black passenger on the Titanic, apart from his daughters who were mixed
Yes.
race, because he actually had a white wife,
Mm-hmm.
which probably would have garnered a lot of stares, especially
Probably.
considering he was second class.
Yes.
And so, but obviously he ended up, perishing in the disaster, but his
Yes, he
wife
did.
and his two kids lived.
Yes, they did.
And I think one of his daughters was among the last survivors. And so she was like, a person of color on the Titanic who survived. And his story hasn't really been told all that much up until recently. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people don't even know that there was a Haitian guy aboard the Titanic.
That's news to many people. And
No,
it just, what's the old saying? It's like history is told by, the victors or what have you. It's not to say there was a victor in the situation, but
right.
this was before this country as a whole really started to give any voice to people of color. We were very much, only in the practice of elevating white voices. So of course, in the aftermath of all this, they weren't exactly seeking out the
No,
woman whose Haitian husband had died. Sadly, they should have. They basically very obviously did not care.
no, they did not. I mean, during the inquiries, I mean, first of all, they mostly only interviewed first class passengers.
Mm-hmm.
Very few third class passengers of any ethnicity were asked about their experiences at all,
I
in
know.
at least in the official inquiries. And those that were, white English speaking immigrants.
Yeah.
And then, like, I also heard about Masabumi Hosono, who was the only Japanese passenger on the Titanic. He ended up surviving. He was in second class. And apparently, when he returned to Japan, they treated him like J. Bruce Ismay. Like, he
Mm-hmm.
was shunned for having the gall to survive instead of sacrificing himself like all the other noble men did. It's like he literally just had the human impulse to not die.
Yeah.
Why are you denigrating him for it? And it's
It
because that's
is
just how
crazy.
society was.
Yep. It is extremely interesting when you think about it. Again, you were just talking about how some people were like, I would have rather have died than said no. It's just interesting
Mm-hmm.
how in some cases it's like sh- survival is shameful.
Right. Because, like, it's like, well, instead of surviving, you could have helped all these other people. And it's like, yeah, and that would be a noble thing to do. But also, like, I have instincts for self preservation, and I shouldn't really be shamed for that, you
Not
know?
only that, but most of us are not, trained in disaster relief, and I'll fully admit I don't
Also
know
that.
what I would do. what
Right.
is
I
what is my
mean, people are
responsibility?
panicking. Like, what are you gonna do? I mean, that's why, like, obviously, when the sinking first began, people were not panicking because they didn't even believe the ship was sinking. But once it became clear to them, any order was kind of just thrown to the wind. Like, people were climbing on overturned lifeboats, bobbing in the water, desperate to save themselves because, of course, they were.
What am I looking up? I wasn't looking for Astroworld actually. I googled it. What I was looking for was what was that rock concert where, oh God, do you know what I'm talking about, where a bunch of people were crushed to death at the Who
Yes,
concert?
I think it was a Who concert because it
Yes,
was
it
like
was.
so packed. I mean, people were even, I heard reports that there were people who were crushed to death at Woodstock
Yeah,
because
I
there were
mean,
way more people than they were expecting.
well, it's just the whole concept of panic. When panic sets in, when that level of frantic freneticism kicks into action, people, well, they panic. I mean, your sense of logic leaves you because it's no longer about, okay, if I do this and I do that. Your adrenaline spikes up. Everyone around you is panicking. You're panicking. There's no clear sense of direction. And that's how you get, the Who concert. That's how you get Astroworld. That's how you get
Mhm.
these situations where just a panic starts and a crowd surges and people are on.
Exactly. And that's what happened, especially, and then you compound that with like being dunked into freezing cold water.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's gonna make it even worse.
Well, there was that clip in Titanic where the drowning man is using Rose to stay afloat. I mean,
Right.
that's not a normal person's thought. That is a dying person's thought.
Yeah, you can't really blame him. I mean, obviously in the movie we want to blame him. I think like Jack like punches him in the face or whatever. But
Yeah,
like, you can't really blame him for doing that in the throes of death, mostly. Like, this dude has less than 10 minutes to live because he's in 28-degree water. Like, he's going to succumb to hypothermia in 10 minutes. Of
right.
course, he's acting like this.
Everyone, begins to panic, and it's that thing where a lot of people criticize, like, well, I would have done this, well, I would have done that. No one, you
And
never
you don't
know.
know what you would have done. I hear the same
No.
thing about people talking about like what they would have done in like an active shooter situation.
Yep.
It's like, you have no clue what you weren't there. You have no clue what you would have done. You wouldn't have been calm and rational.
No, you would have
No
panicked.
one is. Like, even people who are specifically trained in those scenarios are rarely calm and rational.
Right. It's everything you can to keep yourself as calm and as rational as you can be. But there's
Mm-hmm.
usually some level of at least internal panic because these kind of situations are not, they're not kind. These are literal life and death situations. People don't make the world's best choices in these circumstances.
No, they don't, because the instinct is to just survive.
Hmm. But I think, again, going back to this movie, I think that's also why it's impactful because it is realistic. It shows people panicking, it shows people scared, it shows people trying their best in a situation in which there is no good outcome.
Right. And I think that's why the movie continues to endure, and also just the story of the Titanic disaster itself continues to endure, because it's kind of like the Titanic disaster kind of contrasts with, like, say, ships that were sunk because they were involved in a war or something. Like, this was pure, just essentially bad luck. Like, there were no hostilities going on. Like, the ship wasn't torpedoed like the Lusitania or anything. It was it had the misfortune to hit an iceberg on an extremely clear night when there was no moonlight, and it was still, they couldn't see the iceberg because they forgot the binoculars, and the iceberg struck the ship in such a way that it, breached like just one more watertight bulkhead than it could stay afloat on. And it was just pure bad luck. And so all of these people were doomed due to a set of kind of naturally occurring circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and so that kind of gets me to the point as like, why is the Titanic over other disasters and other shipwrecks so enduring? And one thing I want to know is like, so I'm going to say I'm autistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have noticed that there are quite a few autistic people who are really into the Titanic, and I'm one of them. And so it's like, why is that? I mean, obviously people who aren't autistic are into it too, but like the people who I have seen who are like super into it, who aren't like, actual researchers, the people who are super into it are like, they tend to be neurodiverse in some way. And so it's like, why this specific shipwreck over others or other natural disasters? Like why is it because of the time period in which it sailed, like that kind of like turning over of like the Gilded Age into World War I? Is it the technology that it employed? And I think it's all of those things. Like it's just a whole bunch of things together that make it extremely interesting, like the nature of the disaster itself, the facts of it, and then the emotional impact that it had on the survivors, and just the fact that it was like, I think, wasn't it like the worst maritime disaster, at least in peacetime, up until very recently, I think.
Something like that.
There's that. So like, yeah. And so like I've been wondering, like, why am I into this? Like, why am I so into this? And I think it is a compounding of all of those factors. One, I am into like machinery and mechanical things, and the Titanic was a technological mechanical marvel
Mm-hmm.
of its time. It was like, it was the most technologically superior like moving vessel of its time period. And so that's really cool. Had all the super cool new tech on it, like wireless radio and all of that. And just yeah, and just the time period in which it happened, and the attitudes of society at that time, and the stories of the people who survived and the ones who didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's just a fascinating subject, but it's still a little bit of a mystery as to why other natural disasters usually don't get the same hype,
Yeah. I mean, I don't have, an Aquatania talk line.
Right. Like, I mean, yeah, the
Or a
Lusitania
triangle
gets it.
shirtwaist factory talk line.
Although, that is also an interesting story. And
Oh my god, yeah.
yeah, and like other shipwrecks, like even the Lusitania is probably at least from the time period, probably the second most famous
Mm-hmm.
shipwreck. But like what is it about the Titanic? And there have been so many, like, as far as I know, there's never been a movie made about the Lusitania or
Not that I'm aware of.
anything like that. So
I don't know.
yeah, maybe
I
it's
don't
I
know.
don't maybe it's an unanswerable question as to why it is specifically the Titanic that we're all obsessed with.
Maybe one day in the future we'll find out, but unfortunately, I don't think today is that day because
No,
I have no
not.
clue. No,
Me either. I'm
me
just
either.
kind of felt like I was going off on a tangent of questions there. It's like,
Oh, that's my
why this?
entire
Why that?
show. But well, Jay, thank you so much for coming on, for talking about your story and about the movie and about like all 800 other things I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah,
All
no,
the
this is
tangents.
great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and we'll see everybody next time, I think. Maybe. We hope.